And I think one of the reasons that food ethics is on the upswing, we're getting near the end here, there's so many things in my life I can't control. I was thinking the other night about, in Alabama, there's a lot of two-lane highways, and for some reason, I was thinking, just one person has to be talking on the cell phone and veer across that yellow line and come right at me, and I'm dead. And I can't really control that. I don't like to think about that a lot. But there have been several kind of head-on accidents in Alabama where someone was talking on the cell phone and did just that. And I hope to God it never happens to me or my wife, but I really can't control it. I'm not going to give up driving. But what I eat, I can control. What my kids eat. And so that's one of the reasons that I think food ethics and public policy is really going to increase. It's one of the few kind of risks I can have absolute control over. I can scrub my vegetables, I can boil them, I can just eat pasta, but I can at least control what goes into my body. There's also a lot of difference between perception of risk and real risk. If you look at the number of articles on mad cow disease, the number of news stories, it's astronomical. If you look at the number of articles even on GM soybeans, still substantial. One of the greatest risks is food poisoning, virtually no articles. One of the greatest things that we could change is the damage to fetuses from women smoking and drinking during pregnancy. How many articles have you seen on that? Virtually none. There's all kinds of banal risks that we face every day we don't write about. Very kind of scary, alarming risks that are sensationalistic, clone babies. We get saturated coverage of, which leads us maybe to ignore the real risk all around us, the things that we can change, like making it illegal to smoke while you're pregnant. And the last things I want to talk about is a little bit of real philosophy and legality. One of the things that people are talking a lot about is something called the precautionary principle. And Europe is using this to block all import of genetically modified food and crops into Europe. And there's various versions of this that are really important in terms of world trade. And they kind of correspond to three common standards of evidence in the law. Beyond a reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence, and a preponderance of evidence. And preponderance of evidence basically means there's a little bit of evidence for it, maybe 51, 49, but really generally it's just like there's some evidence. This is the standard that most states have for advanced directives. If you go into a Karen Quinlan state and there's some evidence that you don't want to be in a respirator feeding tube, most states have a preponderance of evidence law, and that's it. There's one person that comes forward and says she would want to live like that, that's it. In Missouri and New York, after Cruzan, they said that states can require a higher standard, clear and convincing evidence, which de facto means you have to have an advanced directive. Most young people don't, so most people, young girls that are like Karen Quinlan and Nancy Cruzan today, who end up in PBS, stay in PBS because they don't have an advanced directive. Beyond a reasonable doubt is almost impossible to prove in medical ethics. It basically puts the families of PBS victims in an impossible situation of being adversaries and proving just absolutely beyond a doubt that the patient wouldn't have been like this. Well, beyond a reasonable doubt is what the Europeans are using to interpret the precautionary principle. In other words, unless we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that our crops are safe, they're not going to let them come in. And that is an impossible standard to prove. And what I think is really going on is that's a standard that if you used it in the past for penicillin, would have definitely blocked penicillin coming in. And it has no risk kind of reward kind of calculation. We have to have some risk in life or we don't get any reward. But more importantly, I also think this is a mask for trade protectionism. I think the Europeans are using the beyond a reasonable doubt interpretation to basically block American imports of food. And the Europeans, if this is possible to believe, subsidize their farmers even more than America subsidized big Republican farmers. Japan the same way. So the idea that we actually have a free and open global market for food is really a kind of myth. Well, I don't know if you know, two final examples and I'm finished. There was a famous tomato called the Flavor Saver that was one of the biggest spectacular failures in the history of GM food. And it just showed all the wrong ways to do it. Kind of like Monsanto's introduction of GM veggies in London and England showed all the wrong ways to do it. First of all, it didn't taste that good. It was basically designed to last longer from the field to the store. So it was a producer's advantage, wasn't necessarily an advantage for consumers. Secondly, it cost a lot more. Now, why would you pay a lot more for a tomato that didn't taste very good? And when you found out it was genetically modified, it was perceived to have a risk by some people. This was like just stupendously stupid. And people do stupid things in food policy. Take the Red Delicious apple. When I was a kid, a Red Delicious apple used to actually taste delicious. Now they have bred that sucker such that it looks great, but it tastes like cardboard. Right? And now people buy all the other kind of apples, the Fuji apples and the Gaia apples, but they don't buy Red Delicious unless they're unconscious about what they're actually eating. So I think one of the errors that the food industry has done so far is they focus totally on benefits to producers and not on benefits to consumers in terms of genetically modified veggies. And now, because people are starting to distrust the food system, they become more conscious, there's an added problem is that people are going to need to trust the producers more. I think the ideal solution would be if somebody who had a face grew genetically modified corn and sold it to you and you could really trust them, that would certainly help. Okay, so to last slide, I think it's the last slide. I think I'll say something that maybe you'll like here. I think food ethics is poised to be really the kind of bioethics of the next 30 years. I think a place like Iowa State could be like a world leader because you've got a lot of food around you, as I see it, and some people interested in food here. And I think somebody needs to have a kind of food policy think tank where journalists can go to get a fair hearing on various different sides, and there are scholars that are kind of studying all the different aspects of food. NYU just did something kind of remarkable. It's created a PhD in food studies. And this is like an interdisciplinary model that's going to do economics, ethics, food science, culinary, history of food. The history of food in itself, as Jared Diamond showed us in Guns, Germs, and Steel, is fascinating. And the more you think about food, you start finding ethical and philosophical issues just pop up everywhere. And you know, we've just touched and skimmed the surface tonight of all the stuff there is in food. I mean, I think it would be fascinating to be on the front end of food ethics and food policy, to get a PhD at NYU, to be, you know, I can imagine if in the future there'll be not just departments of queer studies and Latino studies and black studies, but food studies. I think that's going to be, you know, we've got bioethics centers all around. Queer studies, by the way, is supposedly an honorific term that gay people themselves have used for the field. Just want to make that clear. So that's it, and thank you very much. If you're just here for the bonus point, you can leave. But we'll take questions for about 20 minutes and then have a little reception, so you can have a ventilation or a psychotic break. Hopefully I've said something to offend everybody. Yes, sir.
You said that for one of the risks that we can control is what we eat.
Yep.
Does that mean that you would then support labeling of GM veggies and other products like that? Since to control what we eat, we would need to know what we are eating.
I think we need, I've come around on this one. I think we do need to label a lot more labeling, not only of genetically modified food, but meat, like the percent of fat content in it, and where it comes from. I think information is good in general, and okay. I think the food industry is going to lose on this one.
Okay, and my other question, you touched on this a little bit, but the risk of cross-pollination, you talked about how Greenpeace did some crazy stuff regarding that, but do you know what the risks are? Because I've heard different things from people in different sides of the field. Like the risk to farmers as far as, you know, corrupting their crops or changing their yields in some way, and then also the risk to the environment.
That's a big question. I mean, I think there are some risks that people have who are trying to produce an organic, pure crop, that their crops will be contaminated by downwind stuff. But that's also a risk from regular crops to people who are doing organic. The risk to the environment is controversial. I mean, some studies have shown that Roundup-ready crops use less pesticides and others more, and I think that's kind of an open question. I do think that the danger of Andromeda strains and superweeds kind of breaking out, that's kind of alarmist and exaggerated. And that's basically the fear that people have professed on. The biggest fear was about the monarch butterfly, and by a fellow named John Losey at Cornell. And we now know that, this was not a good study, and the monarch butterflies were really not endangered. But it was such a powerful symbol to people and such a powerful image that people identified GM veggies as the Starlight corn as a danger to the monarch butterfly. This winter, there was like 1 billion monarch butterflies wintering down in Mexico. I don't know if you saw it. Like half of them died from a sudden frost. And yet, I'm sorry, this was 2 years ago, and yet the next year they all came back. So they're remarkably resilient.
Thank you.
Sure. What about those Altoids in Jell-O? Isn't that amazing that in a convenience store here, there they are for sale right at the counter, Altoids from England.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
It seems to me that one of the things people are afraid of, who are concerned about the environmental effects of GM foods, is a very real concern. We're very careful about invasive alien species. We take very great care to ensure that we don't get another kudzu or purple loosestrife. Well, I don't know. Maybe we don't take nearly enough care. But it seems to me that one of the concerns that people have about genetically modified foods and biotechnology, modified crops in general, is the concern that these crops could become another kudzu or could become another highly invasive species that could cause a lot of damage. It's difficult to weigh in advance the damage that such an invasive species could cause.
I think it's impossible. It's a good question. I think it's impossible to weigh it in advance because we're not omniscient and we don't really know everything. So to me, you make a kind of risk-benefit analysis. Say in Zimbabwe, you would risk a lot, right, to feed people. Let's suppose the evidence turns out that you do use less pesticide, then that would certainly be a benefit and if the benefit can be passed along to consumers of cheaper, better food, then to me that would be worth running some risk to the environment. It's not as if, you have to, I think the whole point of comparing it to meat was you always need to have a comparison when you talk about food safety and the environment. It's not as if our present system and the hog farms, aren't running a risk to the environment now. There's tremendous damage going on. Just to press a button dear to people here in Iowa. And so in that calculus of environmental damage, if we all moved to eating genetically modified foods and away from hogs and beef, we would probably do a lot more for the environment.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Just once?
Since you're the only one asking questions.
One of the places where risk-benefit analysis goes awry is where the cost that's being weighed is disaster, right? So in risk-benefit analysis for individual life, you can say, well, how much, you can talk about how much risk to your life you're willing to take, but at the extreme, right? One of the questions that's asked is, how much would you take for, how much money would I have to give you to take your life now, right?
I think the fair comparison would be, when we drove up here from the airport, we drove on snow, kind of risky on the interstate, There's some risk there. And, the possibility of a head-on collision with the snow or something is a very bad thing, a disaster, I would say. But it doesn't take away from the terribleness of the thing. Nuclear war is a terrible thing. 9/11 was a terrible thing. But I still fly. And you have to, a very small risk of a very, very bad thing is still a very small risk. In other words, it doesn't really change the risk that it's a terrible thing. It's still a tiny risk. So my chances of being in a head-on collision were still very, very tiny coming up here. My chances of being on a plane with a bomb were still very tiny. This reminds me of a good joke. Probably it's the time to tell the joke. A statistician was on a plane recently. Or he was about to get on a plane. A woman was afraid to get on because she said, there might be a bomb on this plane and could be blown up. And the statistician said, it's very unlikely there's a bomb on your particular plane. Chances are, just 1 in a billion, not even that. And she said, yes, but there is some chance. I don't want to take it. I want to be much more sure. And he said, well, what you really need to do is take your own bomb on the plane, because the chances there being 2 bombs are one of the yeah.
I have a question. It relates to food systems from Tyson to Walmart. You talked a lot about the risks to the specific microbes and so forth, and I think you did mention talk about globalization in that, but could you elaborate some on if you see risks, or at least the public recognizing the risks of monopoly and how the systems are becoming so few in the number of players that are acting on things? And are there real risks that we'll be perceiving in the future more on that?
I think there are real risks in terms of accountability and trust. One of the greatest examples of this, which I cannot completely make public, but there is a company, let's say it's Del Monte, but it's not really Del Monte, that is a virtual company. In other words, there used to be a time when people like Del Monte owned the pineapples and owned the canneries and owned the distribution systems, and this company, which is like Del Monte but not Del Monte, has completely subcontracted all that out. And basically Del Monte is a couple guys in offices on computers, doing all this. They just own the label. And that's a kind of dangerous system where, you know how like universities sometimes employ not professors but subcontractors who are part-time faculty, and therefore they have no responsibility for medical benefits or pensions. Well, in the same way, these food companies everything's subcontracted out, so you don't really have any responsibility or legal liability. That's kind of a dangerous system. So they want your loyalty to the brand, and they're using that to sell it, but there's no substance at all behind it. It's all a virtual company. That's sort of the reductio, I think, of trust and it's even worse if that company would be all over the globe. So I think one of the things that when you become more conscious of the whole food system, it does move you towards locally grown food and slow food. Because although it's not that somebody can't deceive you whose face you can see, somebody can say the food is grown organically, but how do you actually know what fertilizer they use, in that farm on the other side of the state? I mean, the whole organic system is based on inspectors. It'd be a good thing for the mafia to get into, wouldn't it?
I'd like to kind of follow up on that and your response. I appreciated your division into the 4 different systems, but I'm wondering whether kind of your exclusive focus on risk, particularly health risk, isn't going to somewhat distort the articulation of the 4 different systems. For instance, it is possible to criticize Greenpeace for so relentlessly speaking of risks and being so impervious to evidence. You can't do both. If you start speaking the language of risk, then you have to start listening to scientists who can begin to quantify the risks or
right.
talk about them. One of the pressures that I see behind slow food is to say that there's other things involved with food, other values aside from just safety. There are life ways that we may want to preserve, however irrational that may seem from the point of view of efficiency. And in that sense, you have the practical policy issues are going to go beyond merely safety and trust in other people's ability to police that safety, to start talking about really what other values are at stake when we're thinking about food and eating.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are, it's not just other values, but even worldviews, all kinds of things involved with food. I really think that one of the things that's going to happen is that people, when they become more conscious, not only about what they put in, but who they eat with, where the food comes from, it'll be kind of like being a vegetarian, where you constantly have to defend yourself and talk about food, but that's okay. I think, you could do worse things in life than focus on food and where it comes from and how it gets sold.
Well, my follow-up question to this, and this was a kind of general question I had to any food ethicist, is then how are we going to
That's a new phrase. I've never heard that before.
Okay. But
It's a good phrase. Maybe you created it right here. Food ethicist.
How are we going to draw the line between food ethics and food policy? Because
I don't think there is a line.
at least in some questions, it's going to end up not to be what the risk-benefit calculation says, but who has to bear the risk and who has to bear the benefits.
Well, I mean,
There could be subpopulations that want to pursue a particular life way, but that's going to be threatened by other agricultural pursuits. They're not all going to be capable of being done at the same time. And these are political decisions as much as anything else that need to be made.
well, in my own sort of bioethics and medical ethics, I actually do make the distinction between personal life. If I want to eat steak in my room by myself, my business doesn't really affect anybody. Morality, where someone else is actually affected. I get in this elevator and someone's smoking. That affects me. It's a moral issue that he's smoking in my air. In public policy, whether we want to do what, say, New York City just did and make cigarettes $8 a pack, that's a way of discouraging young people from smoking without saying you absolutely can't do it. So I think you can, you might want to stop the subsidies to big farmers. That's a kind of public policy issue. But I think you also need to cut people some slack in their personal life. Not everybody's going to be a vegetarian. Not everybody's going to be that interested, right? But I think this is where my dissertation director was Peter Singer, the author of Animal Liberation. I mean, the really radical thing is when you start considering not just other humans, but all sentient creatures and how they're raised for food and whether you're participating in their slaughter and cruelty. I mean, I think maybe the 23rd, 24th century will look back at the way we raise food animals pretty much the way we look back at slavery. But that's my just personal opinion. They'll think, how could they have done that?
I guess maybe just to follow up, Jean, yeah. You've talked quite a bit, thank you again for the presentation. You talked quite a bit about food safety, but I guess maybe the concern that Jean has and maybe I have has to do with food sovereignty. And in fact, sort of understanding risk in a broader term, risk in terms of how is this impacting my well-being, understanding perception of scientists that actually work on these things, articulating concerns that I guess that ordinary citizens worry about with respect to where their food is coming from as well. Concerns about how individuals and communities, as Jean pointed out, will be affected by the commercialization of genetically modified foods. So maybe if you could just say something about food sovereignty and how we could develop an infrastructure where we could hold,
You need to tell me a little bit more what food sovereignty is. I'm not exactly sure what that is.
the ability to act commensurate with your values. And so if you value, say, family farming, for example, or, sort of smaller communities, then you should be able to have alternatives that allow for that sort of actualization of that sort of
Well, if you say you value family farms but don't shop in locally grown produce, then you're a hypocrite, aren't you? But it may also mean going out of your way to buy the food. And, if you're a harried parent trying to kick your kids to soccer practice, your time may be very valuable. So there's always going to be a trade-off between efficiency and. One of the things our system does do is it produces a lot of food cheap and a lot of choices, kind of like the Walmart model, but not the boutique model. And I guess, you can't mandate that top down. I'd like to think that people vote with their feet and their pocketbooks about that, and that as people become more conscious, they will make different kinds of choices about food. I know in Birmingham we have one seafood restaurant that every day brings up fresh food from the Gulf. That's actually the cheapest and best seafood restaurant in town, but a lot of other people pay 5 times as much for fancy restaurants or frozen seafood, and I just think they're nuts. But they almost eat like they're unconscious. So I think a lot of people, we're very workaholic Americans. A lot of people, this is very hard for me to accept, but some people just eat to sort of do it and get on to their work. One of my friends just kind of eats soup, the same soup, every day for dinner. He's a workaholic, you know. I don't know, maybe he doesn't have any taste buds, I don't know. It's kind of sad. Kind of like people that are colorblind, you know. Yeah.
I have a question, but I'd like to make a few comments first. First of all, I did agree.
Is this going to be a lecture?
No,
Okay.
no. I mean, I did agree with some of your points, especially earlier on. I think
Some of
there's-
them.
Well, I agree with a lot of your points.
Oh, good.
And I think that there's a lot of room for genetically modified organisms to feed people and to be very beneficial.
But
Well, I have to say that I found the discussion of ecofascism and some of the elements of the environmental movement to be offensive, and worse yet, to be dangerous.
well, I
Because
told you I was going to offend everybody, right?
Sure, and I understand that, but I think that it was a counterproductive tactic if your goal is to get the environmental movement on your side, if you want to pursue
No, I
people.
think the environmental movement considers me the enemy. But you know, you have to admit that some of the things that were done in Seattle and the destruction of genetically modified crops in Minnesota are acts of vandalism. And you may not realize this, but under the new laws of for 9/11, it's considered domestic terrorism to do this stuff.
And I understand that, but I consider myself an environmentalist. I know a lot of other environmentalists, and there are a lot of people who care about not drilling in Anwar, things like that, or people that are concerned about other issues that don't necessarily, you know, you brought up the idea in your book of environmentalists putting trees before human lives, and personally, I'm not going to kill a baby to save a tree. I think
That's good.
yeah, and I think that most environmentalists that I know don't feel that way. So I think that I guess I was disappointed by that. It almost made me take the book back, you know, because and it almost prevented me from learning quite a bit. And so I would say that I was disappointed by that.
Let me give me 1 second to say one thing. I just read an amazing talk by Michael Crichton, who's done a lot of alarmist stuff himself. This is a talk he gave to a club out in San Francisco, and if you,
I think I've read that too.
it's about environmentalism as a religion, and it's a very nice analogy because he says, you know, according to environmentalists, there was a time when we had a kind of Garden of Eden, and then there was the fall. You know, we had industrialization and bad things that polluted the world, and then we now finally kind of get back to this time. But if you actually look back at our history, it's not true that there was a pure time in the past. Like streets of New York City, people just throw garbage and manure, and you know, New York City is 12 feet higher because of all the stacked manure, and that manure was not necessarily safe. So I think sometimes environmentalists act like a religion, especially, you know, I mean,
Yeah, and there's certainly people who do that. My point is that there are a lot of us that would like to work with you, that do want to see things get better, and don't necessarily believe that going back to the past is the way to make things better. Otherwise, we'd probably be Republicans.
well, I would. I'm not a Republican, and I would extend my hand to you. I mean, I think that's good as long as the environmentalism is not an absolute value that everything else has to bow to.
Yeah, well, I would like to get to my question, and that is that my question is that you talk about the benefits of genetically modified organisms throughout the book, and you talk about how they can feed people. You criticize egalitarians, and I'm wondering if you do believe that the current method of distribution and production of genetically modified organisms and products is the best way to save lives, or whether it would be possible to publicly fund those projects, to make them much less costly, and to cut down profits to put people first. Because that's something that I didn't see in your book, and that's something that I really want to see in the future. So I'd like to know if you do see the market as more important, or if you think that it's the best way to do it.
I think I do have something to say about that. We have a strange system where on superficially, prima facie, it's saying, well, drug companies, biotech companies invest billions of dollars in products, and so why shouldn't they be able to get return on the money? And they got to satisfy stockholders. But actually, if you look at a deeper analysis, there's something very peculiar going on. Many drugs and devices are actually subsidized by American taxpayers. We have this very strange system where, like, NIH subsidizes artificial heart, and they give it to somebody to sell. The United States subsidizes agricultural research, and they give it somebody to sell. That's a kind of weird system. I mean, it seems to me like if the taxpayers are going to fund all the research, some of the stuff should be public property. And that I think is a really big problem. The other thing is there's really big problems in the world. When I first started out in bioethics, I first heard about AIDS. There were like 12 cases of what was called gay-related immune disorder, now called AIDS. Now there's 40 million people infected, maybe 80 million people will be infected soon. A lot of people are starving. There's a very powerful argument for something I think called mandatory licensing, where basically you say that governments in South Africa and India, instead of giving the usual royalty to drug companies, will give like 1/100th. Still gives a little bit. And you could say the same thing about people that are starving, that the tools should be available to them because the good of saving all these people is so much more important than maximizing profits. And so in terms of intellectual property rights, basically even within the framework of the World Trade Organization, it says that developing countries in times of national crisis can institute mandatory licensing, compulsory licensing. So this is a way in which these drugs and tools could actually be made available and kind of has satisfied both sides, maybe a little bit. And the main thing, I mean, I was talking about this to some medical students the other day. I was saying, the most interesting thing to me about why I think food ethics is needed and bioethics is important, the problem with solving AIDS is basically an ethical problem. We know how it's transmitted, we know how to prevent it, but we disagree tremendously about how to stop it. We disagree about whether giving out condoms promotes AIDS or prevents it. Some people think it makes people more promiscuous and only abstinence. Well, so it's basically an ethical problem, but if you could solve that ethical problem, you would save more lives than all the drugs and surgery and doctors in the world. You might save 40 million people from dying. So it's a pretty important problem to save, to solve. And the same way about using new biotech tools to solve famine. I mean, there's so many people dying of famine, and but you just can't transfer food there for reasons explained in the book because it violates too many rights along the way. But to solve that problem would again save so many lives. So in a way, it's really exciting that you could do so much good solving a problem in ethics and public policy, but it's also frustrating at the same time. Because it's kind of like Pogo said, to really date myself, we met the enemy and he is us. Partly is the matter of getting us to agree on the right way to do it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for coming tonight. I came by myself tonight, so my wife wouldn't witness me making a fool of myself. But anyway, I have some concerns about technology and chemical technology and what it does to the university and what it does here at Iowa State. I think there are some alternatives in technology to produce food, produce corn, whatever it is, that is not being acted upon by the university. In other words, the university isn't finding funds to support alternative technology, whether it be mechanical technology to get rid of weeds in fields rather than using BT corn or whatever it is and insects and all that other kind of stuff.
Could you be more specific about what exactly you're...
Well, to be more specific,
about the mechanical, like more...
robot type machines that would go out, identify plants, identify what's a weed, what's not a weed. There are only about 20 million plants, corn plants, in a square mile. You have the technology today to take data on every one of those 20 million plants, know exactly where they are, and devise or make machines that would till around all of these plants.
Sort of nanotechnology that would go out
without using any chemical technology at all. But the funding for the university comes from big chemical companies, and they support research which eventually ends up selling more chemicals and sprayers and things like that. But nothing is done for a person like myself that's interested in mechanical technology to take care of some of these problems. I talked to some professors, I can do this and this and this and this. He says, that's all fine, well and good, but I can't get any money to do what you want to do. He says, I get money from here and there, here and there. Most of them are chemical companies, and they're interested in doing things different ways. You're talking about...
You'd have the university appeal for grants to like the American Metal Works Association or something to get somebody to fund that kind of research.
Can you...
I can't tell the university what to study and what to fund. And, one of the things about being a professor is usually you have a lot of freedom. There are things that are kind of cool that are happening. Some guys down in Auburn have actually developed a little strip that you could potentially put for a couple pennies in every package of meat that would turn a color if certain kinds of bad germs were in there. And I think this is something that the industry has resisted, but you could actually have this strip in there on top of the chicken or the beef, and if it was glowing fluorescent green, you would know, don't buy that sucker. And it's pretty simple and cheap to make. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the actual process of genetically
Probably
modifying
time for
foods.
2 more questions. Yeah, sorry.
I have a question regarding the process of actually genetically modifying foods. I don't know much about the actual process, and you made a distinction between that and actually like the traditional method of crossbreeding plants. And what exactly do they do to genetically modify something? Is it it's the insertion of a gene from some other organism into like the desired organism, right?
Or yeah, maybe a couple of genes.
A couple of genes.
Something called a gene gun sometimes.
Interesting. What sort of process do they have for deciding which genes go into what? Is it sort of haphazard, or do they actual?
Well, for example, we know what certain genes for phosphorescence are. And you know how that pretty much what they do. So if you inject it, say, into a rabbit, you know what it'll do, or into a plant. So we can use them as markers and stuff like that. So that's actually a pretty safe thing to do because you already know what it
And
does.
it's also very they expect, or they know what to expect from the result.
Yeah.
They actually know the genes.
It's been
All right.
studied.
And the follow-up question: do you believe that the testing mechanisms for finding, like you mentioned, like the peanut gene in soybeans they found it wasn't good? Do you believe that method for testing these things is actually adequate to catch any sort of problems with like allergens or anything like that?
Yeah, because we pretty much know what the allergens are. As long as we don't want a perfect system that reduces all risk, which is impossible. But yeah, I mean, it's actually because of the self-introduction of Americans, people have been eating genetically modified soybeans and corn for a long time. Nobody's dead. No one's really had any kind of strange, mysterious illnesses. There aren't people who are suddenly dropping dead, and we don't know why.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
It's kind of like when we used to think that AIDS was casually transmitted. And I used to tell the medical students in the early 1980s, if that was really true, there should have been all these doctors and nurses in California who were treating AIDS patients who suddenly developed AIDS. If it was casual. And those cases didn't come about. So we know from look-back studies that it wasn't easily transmissible. Yeah, you get the last question.
I'd kind of like to know that when you decided to make the transition to stop eating meat, and from watching your presentation here, it seems like you're afraid of a lot of things, maybe.
I'm like that guy in the Ben Stiller movie, right?
I don't know. I've been eating meat all my life. I'm still alive. Do you feel like you're lucky that you've lived as long as you have?
I may have presented the wrong picture. I grew up playing football and wrestling, and before we had Saturday morning footballs, and my mother would cook me a steak every morning. Eagle Scout. It was a pretty normal, all-American guy. But basically, I like to live a long time. And I noticed that Seventh-day Adventists often live to 100. I had a grandmother who was a vegetarian. She lived really long. I think maybe when my grandfather worked really hard all day, lots of physical labor, he needed a lot of meat and fat. I don't have that kind of lifestyle. So I think the moral arguments, the safety arguments, and the health arguments all kind of go together to me. Not to eat meat. It's a personal decision.
Yeah,
but I actually, it is true that I actually live by it.
I just try not to let, what I eat you know, like, I mean, you know, live in fear so much, that's all.
To me, it's not fear so much as becoming aware of everything about where the food comes from. It's, you know, I mean, here's a good test, and maybe you would pass it. But first time I went out with my grandfather and killed a chicken, and actually plucked it, I couldn't eat chicken for a long time. And maybe, you know, we should have to, you know, if we don't want to kill it ourselves. My mother raised a pig, and she didn't want to kill it. You know, she got really attached to that pig. Pigs are smart, and she cried for a month when my grandfather killed it, and she never forgave him. And to this day, she has trouble eating bacon. So maybe that's a good test. That if we wouldn't actually kill it ourselves, we shouldn't eat it. You might be willing to pass that test.
We raise our own organic beef, pork, and chickens, and we kill chickens on our own on occasion, and we sell, you know, we get slaughtered at a local locker. So.
But you know, there are a lot of people that tell me that if they had to kill it themselves, they wouldn't eat it. What do you think about them?
We've done it before, and we still eat it anyways.
No, I mean, do you think they're hypocrites?
Yes.
If they won't kill it themselves, but they want somebody else to do the dirty work?
Well, it's all about efficiency, isn't it?
No, I think it's about not being a hypocrite. You know,
it's
you're,
like saying if you can't fix your own car, well, I can't drive a car. Or if I can't make my own pants, I guess I'm going to run around naked. I mean, that's a horrible argument to say that.
well, not when you're causing another being to suffer and die. I mean, it's, don't you think?
Well, it's, I guess if you perceive that you're causing us to suffer, but I don't.
Well, it's like saying I don't want to buy stuff from sweat factories, you know, I mean.
Yeah.
Yes?
Oh, I work where they put down a lot of animals to, well, it's a diagnostic lab. And you know what? There's not one single pig or cow that want to be put down to save the rest of the herd. And you know what? It's just like those animals who are put down for bacon or ham or whatever. You know what? They do not want to be bacon and ham. I mean, I can look at pepperoni pizza and I still hear it squealing.
This is a real touchy issue, I know, in Iowa, but, you know, if you actually have ever been around a pig, pigs are smarter than dogs and cats, I believe. A lot smarter than horses. And I think it's a real shame that such intelligent animals have to be our food. They're really wonderful creatures, even pets.
At this point, I have to call an end to the discussion. However, there's a small, looks like a rather small reception over there.
And I have read Mood, too.
Let me once again thank people who came, and thank Greg Pence for coming to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.